Hello, this is another in a set of videos aimed at beginning aerobatics competition. I've done a previous video presenting the same flight as an introduction to contests. This one is not about flying so much as the results, the scoring and judging. It's for someone who maybe has competed once or twice and is looking to get a little deeper into it. This is not essential. I've always just looked at my standing, glanced at the score sheets when I picked them up, and got on with life. This is a deeper dive into what those score sheets were telling me, whether or not I cared to listen to them. It starts with the rulebook available on the IAC website. In theory, this tells you everything you need to know about the judging process. If you want a bit more than that, though, you should probably try to attend a judges' school, either online or in person. They're generally held in two parts. The first day is an introductory session, and the second day a more advanced review, mostly for current judges needing recurrency. It's for learning how to judge, not fly, but it's useful enough for competitors also, and you'll meet the people who will be judging you. I'll refer to the rules in this video, but it's not particularly intended to teach you what they are. So, lots of talking ahead. Let's get to it. The event is the Green Mountain Aerobatic Contest at Springfield, Vermont, held in July 2021 by IAC Chapter 35. The airplane is a relatively standard Christen Eagle. I've got lots of decathlon time and sportsman experience, but this airplane is fairly new to me. I've been critiqued once or twice, but this is the first contest and I'm not quite sure what to expect. The camera is mounted ahead and to the right of me, looking forward. It's not an optimal view for what I'm doing here, but I'm still working on how to best use it with this airplane. This is an early attempt. It has metrics displayed on the video from an internal GPS and accelerometer, but they aren't terribly accurate, particularly during aerobatics. I mount the camera specifically to see as much of the panel as possible, and generally use and reference the aircraft instruments to see what's going on during these videos. There is, by the way, no prop filter as it tends to wash out the instruments in shade. The box has only 3 markers all along the front line, which is along the main runway. There's not much else distinctive to mark this box. I've got another video on a YouTube channel about flying the primary category that discusses this in depth, but in short, I key on the field between the ramp and the runway, north of the taxiway, that the judges are sitting in the middle of. There are boundary guards guarding the left, right, and front box lines only. There's nothing in the back. The wind today is from the judges' right to left, which is the B form, and a slight y-axis wind front to back. A little digression about the scoring process. If you're familiar with it, feel free to skip ahead a minute or two. There are, in this case, 5 judges watching the aircraft. They have an assistant who is looking at the figures on a sheet, calling out the figures so that the judge doesn't have to look away. And if they have time, they'll watch also and help out the judge. And a third person, a recorder, who's writing everything down. All the scores and as many remarks as the judge gives and the recorder can manage to scribble down. The remarks are usually optimal. We'll get back to that in a minute. Here is a typical score sheet, and also some of the more or less standard shorthand used. I confess I didn't actually know a lot of these, and probably explains a few things that I've seen scribbled down on my score sheets that I never understood. After the flight, meaning all the contestants flying this particular sequence, is done, these score sheets are taken to the scorer, who is sitting in a building somewhere typically, and the scores are entered into a computer program. The remarks are not. They are only on the score sheets. The contestants get the raw score sheets and a summary sheet. Something I'd never paid attention to until preparing these videos. There is more data available on the IAC results web pages. By clicking on a contestant's name, you can get more details of their scores. So you can actually see more about the people who, both yourself and the people you are competing against. So you've got not only your scores, but numeric information about how every judge scored the same figure for other people, which can be kind of interesting at times. The basic scoring concept is that every figure starts with a perfect 10. You're marked down in half-point increments, down to a minimum of 0. There are specific criteria for marking down in some cases. In others, it's up to the judge, as long as they evaluate everyone to the same standards. Each figure has a difficulty factor, a K factor, and the resulting uh, 0 to 10 scores are multiplied by that K factor. So digression over back to the flight. Here's the sequence. There are 9 figures without any y-axis wind correction opportunities. The y-axis is perpendicular to the front line of the box. This is basically just back and forth in front of the judges. This is the Sportsman category. There are techniques for wind correction cheats where you correct for wind blowing you front and back without the judges noticing. They're kind of tricky. Anybody good enough to do that is probably going to win Sportsman anyway on overall skill. I know I certainly can't do it. So this is a little bit of a problem with this sequence. I'm number 2 in the order of flight. So while the higher categories have done some flying, I haven't seen anyone else's Sportsman flight to see what happens when someone simply flies 9 figures back and forth. I have just done the low lines where I fly through the bottom at the bottom of the box, wagging my wings to mark the box boundaries as best I can so that the judges can calibrate their perspective before everyone flies. I've never done this before. I did a terrible job at it, got confused, and at this moment I'm feeling kind of flustered and certainly did not get any value out of flying through the box a few times. I do know I need to start near the front of the box because there is a bit of a wind front to back, but I also rarely practice at box altitude. I'm usually practicing much, much higher. So I don't have a good handle on the perspective involved, and I'm not particularly confident about my position. Okay, to the flying. Every clip will have the end of the previous figure and start of the next figure shown so that you can see the line drawn between each figure. So the videos will overlap. It's not strictly contiguous. You'll see why I do that in a minute. Figure 0 is the entry and wing wag. It is not scored, but the judges are watching and forming opinions of me. I'm making this video 6 months after the contest, but as I recall, my goal was to end at about 3,000 feet, 160 miles an hour, bottom of the yellow arc. But I honestly had not been practicing the wing wag much, and it's about to show. If you look carefully at the video and the box markers in judges field on the ground below, it appears as if I'm starting a little early on this. I come out at maybe 190 miles an hour and about 2,800 feet. Figure 1, loop, first scored figure. This is required to be perfectly round from the perspective of somebody looking up at maybe a 45-degree angle, the judges. It has to be x-axis wind corrected, so it's got to be drawn out a little bit into the wind and accelerated a little bit downwind. I'm not terribly good at them. I tend to lose my feel for them over time. Plus, I have been flying a decathlon regularly, and as mentioned, I'm starting a little bit off balance. As far as I recall, I was not worrying about the looping segment x-axis winds, and I don't believe there's really enough wind to bother with it here. My first rule is no mistakes. I'm aiming most of all for a clean flight in my first Eagle contest. So I should be starting the loop directly in front of the judges. First figure, center box. Make a good impression. Looking at the 270 point, when you're pointed straight down in this upcoming video, I believe I'm a little bit early. I rushed it and started too early. I had extra airspeed going into it, way too much, and I could have easily waited a second or two. I did not start focused and relaxed. So I started the loop at about 185 miles an hour, much faster than I typically do it, 2,800 feet, and I ended with a lot less energy, 145 miles an hour at 2,900 feet. Starting a loop really fast is not a good use of your energy. It just bleeds off. I had had complaints during critiquing before the contest, but I would have said that this loop was not bad. As I just noted, my position does look a little early on the x-axis, starting the pull before center box. I was rushing it. I had extra airspeed. I should have just relaxed, been more attentive to my position. I might also be a tiny bit inexperienced flying in a box with this airplane, but that's just an excuse. I'm also about center box on the y-axis, front to back. Not a great place to start with the wind blowing to the rear and no wind correction opportunities available during the sequence. I should be near the front, much closer to that runway running along the front of the box. So here are the results. I've copied them from my score sheets and the IAC website data. An important point here on this and all the other figures, the remarks are not required. They're just what happens to get noted by the judge and written down by the recorder. No remark doesn't mean you did it right, just means they didn't say anything about it. The judge presumably has marked you down on their score tallies. One thing's clear, it was not a great loop. The remarks include L-shaped, meaning I didn't float enough over the top, and the top radius was not the same as the rest of the loop. And I probably made sort of a sharp corner on that last quadrant, judging by the pinched bottom remark. Note the altimeter showed I started at 2,800 and ended at 2,900, which is about as much as most judges are going to notice. And one person did note it. One thought I ended lower, so that part was probably good enough. The most interesting thing here was the no line between remark. If you go back and replay the clip, there's pretty clear entry and exit lines, so I'm not sure what this was about. If there really is no line between figures, by the way, the correct scoring on that is to take 1 point off of each figure. Otherwise, loop score downgrades are up to the judge. There's no fixed criteria on how you score not perfectly circular loops. You are supposed to evaluate everyone equally. So my absolute score isn't really so important as my rank, as long as all the judges score all the contestants by the same criteria. So this is where the IAC website comes in handy. If you go to that and look at the details for my flight, the third column from the right, the numbers in parentheses, shows what my ranking was on that one figure. I was 11th of 13. It sucked. Not a great start. By the way, if you look at the other contestants' detailed scores on the website, the second highest scoring loop in this flight was by someone flying their first contest. So I kind of expect he's going to be beating me in intermediate in a few years. Moving on. Figure 2, half Cuban with 2 of 4 hesitation roll. The 5/8 loop should be exactly like the full loop, round with wind correction by the pilot. 45 lines are based on 45 degrees off the vertical zero lift line of the wing, not the airplane path. My understanding is that more refined levels of competition work this 45 thing on a few points. First, various airplanes present poorly. Judges cue on fuselage lines and not the wing mean chord line. Second, changes in flight path influence perception. So the flight path of an airplane slowing down on a 45 up will flatten out and be perceived as a pitch down. I'm not going to deal with this stuff at the Sportsman level without very focused, expert ground coaching. So I'm aiming for dead on the 45 wire on the sighting device, or as well as I can with a mountainous horizon. The first goal, as always, no mistakes. Lines should be the same length, which is impossible to see inside the cockpit. That's experience from prior ground critiquing. I generally go approximately 3 count on the slow line, 2 count on the fast line. The point, the pause on the knife edge of the roll, need only be long enough to be seen as a full stop by the judges, with constant roll rate before and after the point. And the results. Pinched top. Judge 3 still doesn't like my loops. It's a lot harder to judge the roundness of a 5/8 loop than a full one, and the judges are thinking more about the line and roll than the loop. So I can probably get away with more mistakes on the loop, but they're obviously still suspect. One complained shallow after, meaning the second straight line after the roll was pitched up a little, less than 45 degrees. Only one said it, but note that no comment just means I don't know why they're subtracting points, not that I didn't do it. No one complained out loud about my line length, which is a favorite item to downgrade and easy to call out. There should be 1 point for any inequality, 2 points for a 2-to-1 difference. That's a big difference, by the way. The rulebook doesn't actually seem to call out half-point downgrades on this that I can see, but I assume judges do it anyway. It's not easy to get those line lengths perfect, so you can generally assume that people are giving you 1 point off, regardless of whether or not they say so. Now the interesting part. 2 HZs, hard 0. That means I did something that disqualified the figure. Generally did not present a required feature of it, such as leaving out the hesitation in the roll. If I just did so many incremental mistakes that my score was reduced from 10 to 0, they must give me a numeric 0, 0.0. HZ is not the same as 0.0. If a judge gives HZ, they are required to explain it in the remark. One did say no line between. Lines between figures are numeric deductions, so omitting the 45 lines is a numeric deduction, as I understand the rules. Is this no point or a judging mistake? Go back and replay the figure. One judge gave no remark on the hard 0. Here's why you're getting your money's worth from this free video. If a judge gives an HZ, they must explain why in the remarks, or it can be challenged by the competitor and discarded. Judge 5's HZ score was invalid, but I must file a protest to someone on the contest jury to get it discarded within 2 hours of score sheets being made available. Longer if I'm busy with volunteer activities. So read your scores, know the rules. In any case, no action was needed by me because only 2 of 5 judges said it was an HC. For that to stand, over 50% must score it so 3 out of 5 or 3 out of 4. Otherwise, the minority HCs are discarded from the scoring. The figure came out ranked number 2 of all the competitors, so I wanted to have this figure scored. Okay, move on. The pace of this will be picking up a bit as I slog through all the basic issues here at least once. Figure 3, Immelman, half loop up, half roll. Standard judging criteria for the loop and the roll, which we'll get to in a bit. There should be no noticeable line between the loop stopping and the roll starting. The CG of the aircraft does not sink during or after the low speed roll. The pitch, in theory, doesn't matter as you fly off. They like to look for lines between the two, and they like to look for you sinking as you fly off the top of the loop at a very low speed. So Immelman remarks, pinched top, second quarter, pinch top. They did not like the second quarter of my half loop up. There was only one descending complaint, and that often makes it into their remarks, at least with me, because I think because they're waiting for it. So I'm not too worried about that. Maybe they were distracted by my cruddy loop. I can't remember if I was doing something specific on that loop 6 months later. I recommend taking notes. It was ranked 8 of 13, so pretty mediocre. My new airplane obviously needs some work on the loops. There was an out called on me on the north boundary, so I flew entirely out of the left side of the box reported by the boundary judge. Recall that I started the entire sequence a little early, and this is the result. The individual's figure scores shouldn't reflect this, but there is a 5-point penalty applied to your total score at the end. If I had taken a break to reposition after the half Cuban, I'd also get penalized 5 points for an interruption, so there would have been no net loss. So I should have checked my position better and reacted before the start of this figure. If you look on the video again, you'll note that I paused about 2 seconds before starting it. Not much time, but it should have been enough. If I had known it was coming, I maybe could have shortened that 2 seconds very slightly, or better, just taken a break and gotten into a better position. You'll notice I had a very long line afterwards before the figure 4 starts, because I realized after the figure that I was way out of position and just had to motor forward a bunch. An interesting little end note on this figure, if you watch the clip carefully again, you'll see that I stopped the roll slightly short. I under-rotated it and then gradually eased off the bank to wings level over the period of a couple of seconds. If I had done a sharp correction immediately upon stopping, the judges would have been more likely to notice it. I didn't get any under-rotated comments. They certainly had plenty of time to write something down. So presumably I got away with it. This also might be a bit of a difference between the stubby Eagle biplane and a nice long wingspan decathlon, which I may have more to say about at the end of the video. Figure 4, what I call a goldfish. It's a push to a 45 down, pull to a 3/4 loop ending in another 45 down inverted, half roll upright in the center of the line, and then pull to level. Everything's scored to the same criteria that I've been talking about, so the only thing additional to note here is that the figure start and end altitudes do not need to align to the top and the bottom of the loop. And the results. Here's a shocker, lots of loop complaints. I'm not actually certain exactly where in the loop some of these remarks are referring to, so I'll just leave them here and you can loop at them as you wish. There were 2 shallow calls and 1 slightly steep remark, so probably a shallow angle on at least part of the 45s, probably the second at the end of the figure. 1 short line after the roll. Lots of complaints, but the score wasn't too bad and was ranked second in the flight. This is important because this had a K difficulty factor of 18. That means that the scores are multiplied by that. So that's important. Figure 5, what I call a shark's tooth, some people call it a wedge. Basically a half Cuban with a vertical up line in the middle of the loop. So pull to a vertical up line, hold the line long enough to present a straight line, pull over on your back to a 45 down. In the middle of the 45 down, roll upright, and then pull to level flight. Mercifully for me, the 3 radii involved here do not have to match. So the shark's tooth remarks, slight positive up. That means that on the vertical up line, my canopy was more towards the sky. I was basically pitched forward a little bit. Two closed lates, which I guess means that I finished the top radius at a lower altitude than the judges thought I should. I think probably what that means is that I established my 45 down line at about the altitude that I ended previous 45 down line, and it should have in fact been a little bit higher. The exact altitude that um, top radius should be exited is a trigonometry problem, and I doubt the judges have ever worked this one out. But if it's just basically the same altitude, that's pretty obviously not correct. It's basically a decreasing radius of that top loop. It was ranked first out of everybody, so I won't complain about that. Figure 6. Pull, 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 Humpty Bump. Pull to a vertical, draw a vertical line, pull over in a half loop to a vertical down, draw a vertical line, pull upright. Vertical lines do not have to be equal lengths. The important criteria here are establishing vertical lines, both up and down, the quality of the half loop, and the altitude of the loop start has to match the altitude of the loop end. So a very common complaint here is finish late, meaning you're starting the vertical line down at a lower altitude than you finished the vertical line up. The Humpty Bump scores, I have 3 positives, so I definitely need to be working on my vertical lines, and 2 closed lates. So I need to accelerate my pull a little bit on that one. The two figures, one after the other, with basically the same complaint, the vertical upline and then the pull over on my back, are a pretty good indication that I probably need to work on that. It ranked third though, so again, not complaining. A little note I'm inserting afterwards about the Humpty Bump. If you look at it again carefully, you'll see that when I set the vertical down line, there's a little bit of a bobble, waggle the wings a little bit. I do not appear to have been, well, they didn't comment about it in any case. And I find I don't get many complaints about stuff like that. My assumption is they don't see most of them. You could throw me a bone and say it was they're just dismissing it as turbulence, but it really wasn't. It was a slight mistake in the flying. This is maybe another case in which a little stubby biplane has a significant advantage over a nice long wingspan decathlon. Figure 7, Hammerhead, has all kinds of specifics on the scoring, probably because unlike the loop, somebody figured out how to quantify it so that it can be described easily. The rulebook has plenty of diagrams and verbiage on exactly the point assignments here. Basically, it's a vertical upline, a vertical downline, and between the two, a pivot that must be in a flat plane, not too early so that the airplane flies over the top, not too late so that it slides back, and not twisting on its axis, torquing onto its back. Hammerhead scores. Uh, Once again, I have one person complained about a positive up, so I'm still have my canopy up a little bit on the upline, meaning I'm pitched forward slightly. One complained about a slight low close pivot, meaning that I fell backwards slightly during the pivot and the downline started at a slightly lower altitude than the upline ended. The most notable thing here is Judge 4 gave an A for average, meaning that for whatever the reason, they didn't get a good, complete look at the figure and decided that they could not score it fairly. So their score is basically the average of everybody else. It ranked 2 out of the 13, which kind of surprised me. I had had a lot of trouble figuring out hammerheads in the Eagle, and yeah, either got lucky or got it right. I'll take either one. Figure 8, roll. The center of gravity of the airplane needs to move in a level trajectory. The pitch can change however you need it. The 360-degree bank must be at a constant rate. Simple in theory, as a long-time decathlon pilot, kind of hard in practice. Roll scores. When I first started flying decathlons in Sportsman, my goal was not to win, but to see how many pits and extras I could beat. It's really not a level playing field. You have to work a lot harder in a decathlon and really get the basic skills right. Rolls are maybe at the top of that list. I'm thinking this is the payoff. Start in a decathlon, not in a mid or high performance aircraft. Figure 9, 270-degree turn. Bank, pull to start the turn, push to stop the turn, unbank. 4 distinct movements. You got to think about it in advance because if you do your turn so you're pointed off into the wilds of New Hampshire, it's probably not going to go well trying to figure out exactly where your end heading is. I may be able to roll an airplane okay, but I've always been surprisingly bad at aerobatic turns, and this one is no exception. Fortunately, they are pretty low K value, so it never kills me too badly. I did at least think ahead and make the turn so that I ended up pointing at the judges and the runway, so I more or less knew where to stop. A couple of people didn't seem to like my final heading, but it could have been worse. So I haven't been talking about this, but in the upper left corner of the screen, there is a GPS track from the GPS unit in the camera. It's not always accurate, and I don't happen to have any maps that I can superimpose it on in any useful way here. If you've been watching it, you might have noticed that that Immelman that I got called out on was way off to the edge. And this turn also looks like it was just about as far. So in retrospect, I'm a little surprised I didn't get called out here. It was probably right on the edge. Outs in Sportsman are only 5 points, the same as an interruption to reposition, but it's something you don't want to do. And it kind of indicates that I was not particularly situationally aware at this point. I was almost done and I just wanted to get the damn thing finished. So I did at least have the presence of mind to do a quick wing wag as I left the box, which is not required, but which is sort of a nice thing to do and makes the judges feel good. And that's important because they've still got one more score to give you, the presentation. Kind of like the loop, presentation is basically whatever criteria the judge wants, as long as they apply it to all competitors equally. It's essentially whether you presented the maneuvers nicely centered in the box at a reasonable altitude. Mine was pretty bad. As I've noted before, I probably started the loop a bit left of center. You could argue that it should be there based on the sequence, but it's the first figure. It's symmetric, and I think it should be right in front of the judges. The Immelman then went out the left side, and I should have interrupted and fixed that. What was happening, if you look at the camera GPS track again, is that I was drifting left and back the entire time. The drift back is harder to fix, but the drift left is totally avoidable by just paying attention, keeping the downwind lines between figures short, and the upwind lines longer until repositioned properly before each figure. I didn't do that, not enough anyway. I should have known better, maybe a little flustered from the start, and could have benefited from watching others fly. But mostly I hadn't thought through the sequence enough beforehand, imprinting the need for checking downwind drift and extending upwind legs on my plans so that I did it despite being maybe a little off balance and not knowing exactly what the winds were doing. It's like briefing an engine failure on takeoff. By priming yourself to anticipate it, you're more likely to react correctly when it happens. And by the way, if I had interrupted before the Immelman, I'd have gotten a 5-point interruption penalty, but I'd have avoided a 5-point out penalty. So any benefit it had in my presentation would have been a net gain. So certainly would have been worth it. For the y-axis, I did start near the front, but probably not enough. I rarely fly this airplane this low and was a bit concerned about being too close to the judges, making them look straight up at me, which they generally do not like. If you look at some of the clips where I'm pointed down near the end of the sequence, so you can see the buildings underneath me, that's out of the back of the box. There are no boundary judges in the back, so I'm not going to get called out of the box. But at that point, the judges know you're too far back, and the presentation score is how they let you know. Lacking the skills to do in-sequence wind sheets and lacking a y-axis leg in the sequence, that's basically fixable by interruptions, and it would have been worth it. On altitude, I was 2,200 feet at the end. That's okay with me. 1,500 is the floor, and the judges basically call you low by consensus. I probably could have been lower, but didn't want to be because being called low is a catastrophic event. Your entire flight is zeroed. I'm in the habit of staying fairly high in the box, partly out of being conservative and partly because I'm used to flying a decathlon, which is a larger airplane and presents as being lower to the judges who make that judgment call about your altitude without having any hard data. So I probably could have been a little bit lower in the little stubby biplane, but wasn't comfortable doing it. As I've said, first goal, no mistakes. So the overall score was 10 out of 13. Not very good, but fortunately for me, the presentation at the Sportsman level is not really all that valuable. So it was a survivable error. The outcome, to my surprise, I won the flight fairly comfortably. Sportsman is pretty competitive. We try to fly at least 2 and ideally 3 times, and you can fly a freestyle of your own design in Sportsman, but most just fly the known over 2 or 3 times. If I'd been in a decathlon this year, I'd have tried a free for the first time, but with a new airplane, I chose to be conservative and planned to do the known over. That didn't matter because 2 days of rain followed this, and this is all we flew, so I won the category. Would I have won if we'd flown more? No clue. Certainly not a sure thing. Without mistakes, I'd have done pretty well. I can do Sportsman, and with straightforward practice, the Eagle is easier to fly at that level than the Decathlon. A little opinion here, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't agree with me on this. I've never flown a free, and honestly don't think it has much advantage in Sportsman. At higher categories, it may let you avoid high-risk figures and stuff you're bad at, but at Sportsman, you really should be able to fly everything fairly well, and a free probably doesn't buy you enough to justify having to practice and fly 2 different sequences. If it's a really bad known sequence that year, might give you an advantage, but otherwise, this year, no, I really don't think it does. As I'm discovering as I try to make intermediate level sequences for the first time, it'll give you practice in drawing sequences, but it won't let you see the advantages that that grants you. So just to be completely clear on this, because I think that statement I just made will get pushed back by people more experienced than me. If you're preparing for intermediate, it's a different scenario. I'm talking about trying to get to the top of Sportsman. I recommend, by the way, this excellent EAA webinar from, I think, 2014 by Wes Liu. Just search for the title on the EAA website. And as long as I'm mentioning that EAA website, the main goal of these videos is to pull you to the Chapter 35 website and to just provide some encouragement for relative novices. There's lots of excellent material by people who are vastly more skilled than me on that EAA website that you should probably be looking at before this. Go to it. Okay, so what do I get from all this? At my tactical level, my setup was poor. My vertical up lines could be improved. My looping lines were terrible. Lines and loops are a ground critiquing issue. That's where my local IAC chapter practice sessions will be invaluable. I seem to be okay with 45 downlines. And that implies, as a side point, that the frequent positive up calls on my vertical lines, where I'm using the same sight, either my vertical lines were poorly flown, I didn't get the sight right on the horizon, or I maybe need to tweak the presentation of the lines by my aircraft and not just follow the sighting device. Probably more of these kind of issues are random judging variations than we'd like to think, but this was actually pretty consistent. At a strategic level, I pulled out all the contestant individual figure ranks from the IAC website and put them into a table organized by figure difficulty and contestant standing. That turned out to be kind of interesting. First, don't make big mistakes. For a 13 contestant sportsman category, it was surprisingly clean, in my experience anyway. There was only one hard zeroed HZ figure, and the person who got it did pretty well otherwise, probably would have come in a solid fifth or sixth. As an aside, I got curious about this and went back to previous year's results. The last 2 years in particular have been pretty straightforward, just back and forth sequences. And for this contest, this year, they didn't even have a spin. But don't get complacent. Look at some detailed results for 2017, for example, noting the HZs, how people did on figures they didn't HZ, and the number of penalties. In the Springfield contest, 4 of 8 contestants had HZs. Note also the very curiously laid out official sequence card for that year that starts in the middle of the card and then jumps to the top. So back to this contest, no one's standing was changed by the point value of breaks and penalties that I can see. Take a break or two if you need it. The lowest 2 contestants flew very capable airplanes, but obviously muffed specific figures and either did very or pretty well otherwise. Consistency matters. Don't make any big mistakes. Above that, the lower part of the standings had generally lower scores, but they also had a lot of variation. The people who did better in the standings were more consistent. The bottom line, the reason I won was that I did consistently well in the high K figures. I screwed up the loop, the turn, the presentation, but I did well where it mattered, the high K figures that had a big multiplier. One thing I'd never focused on, the hammerhead and shark's tooth in particular, are very common in sportsman level, and they're also very valuable. Figure them out, get consistently good at them. It also sort of raises a question of how I can, for example, do a good goldfish if I can't do a good loop. Maybe I just muffed the loop and did better on the goldfish 3/4 loop. Maybe the judges get distracted by the additional components. I don't know. But starting out, pay attention to the basics. If you don't have that, everything is mediocre. Once you've got that down, make sure you nail the higher K figures. Hammerheads, stuff with 45 lines. So this was a much longer slog than I expected it to be at the start, but that's all I've got. I recommend the EAA and IAC websites for lots more information. I used to work for Michael Goulian and taught with and still often refer to both his books on basic and advanced aerobatics. And Alan Cassidy's Better Aerobatics book is probably the gold standard nowadays. I do recommend being cautious and thoughtful about taking anonymous internet advice, particularly since you've shown yourself susceptible to it. Here you are listening to me. Mostly connect up with the nearest IAC chapter. The chapter I belong to, Chapter 35, based in Nashua, New Hampshire, has monthly meetings, a community that is happy to help newcomers, and we have numerous activities in the region from practice sessions to contests to Young Eagles events and all kinds of stuff. It's a indispensable resource, particularly if you're competing, so take advantage of it. That's it. Thanks for listening.